9 o'clock in the morning on the 18th of September 1944, on the southern approach to the road bridge at Arnhem, a German officer stood upright in the open turret of a captured British staff car. His name was Victor Grebner. He was 30 years old, and around his neck hung the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, pinned there by his divisional commander barely 18 hours earlier. Behind him, engines running, sat 22 armoured vehicles of the 9th SS Reconnaissance Battalion. Somewhere ahead, in the houses around the northern end of the bridge, were British paratroopers, and nobody on the German side knew how many. Grebner raised his fist and pumped it forward, and the column accelerated onto the bridge at full speed. The first armoured cars swerved through the wreckage of the previous night's fighting and broke clear through into the town beyond. Then the half-tracks came on behind them, open-topped, packed with men, and the houses on both sides of the ramp erupted. Anti-tank guns fired down the length of the bridge at point-blank range. Grenades rained from upper windows into the open vehicle beds. Men burned in the steel boxes they had no way of leaving. Within the hour, Victor Grebner was dead, dozens of his men were dead, and the burning wrecks of his battalion littered the bridge ramp in heaps that would still be there when the battle ended 9 days later. His body was never identified. He lies in a German military cemetery in the Netherlands under a cross that reads only Ein deutscher Soldat, a German soldier. We think we know Arnhem. Red berets dropping from a clear September sky, a bridge too far, 4 days of courage, and a gallant defeat. But that is not what happened in those streets. Arnhem, September 1944, men holding a bridge they were never meant to hold alone, waiting on reinforcements that weren't coming. That idea of holding a position with basically nothing, timing and nerve being the only thing that matters, which is actually a decent way into today's sponsor, Medal Hunter, because it's built around exactly that. No auto-aim, it's all about timing, waiting for the right moment to take your shot. You're stuck holding a wave, and it's one shot to make it count. This video is sponsored by them, just to be upfront. It's 3-wave PvP, and instead of running around spraying bullets, you're on a stationary weapon, flak, artillery, sniper, and you're just waiting. The locations are actually great as well: Pearl Harbor, Warsaw, Vietnam, Afghanistan, real operations, and obviously I like realism, so that's a big plus for me. As you win, you build up your haven, you collect gunner cards, you climb the leagues, and it's not really about who shoots first, it's about who aims better and plans smarter. Look, I don't shill games I don't play. Go download Medal Hunter, links in the description, use code Historyatwar, and you'll get 5 gunner commanders, the most powerful in the game, for free. Same code's pinned in the comments, so you don't have to scrub back for it. Go check it out, seriously. Arnhem was where 2 of the proudest fighting forces of the Second World War met head-on, at a range of 5 metres. On one side, the British 1st Airborne Division, all volunteers, the finest light infantry Britain ever raised, told they were dropping onto old men and invalids. On the other, the survivors of the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions, veterans of Kharkov and the Eastern Front and the slaughterhouse of Normandy, the hardest residue of an army that had left its best men dead in Russia. These were not broken remnants, and this was not a clean and gallant battle. It was house against house and hand to hand, grenades down staircases, tanks firing into bedrooms, wounded men lying in cellars while the buildings burned above them, a week of close-range killing that veterans of the Eastern Front called the hardest fighting of their lives. And in the middle of it, something happened that almost never happened anywhere in this war. The shooting stopped by agreement in the middle of the battle, and a general of the Waffen-SS handed a British colonel a bottle of brandy and told him it was for his commanding officer. This is Arnhem, as it really was, not the film, the battle. And it was far worse and far stranger than the legend suggests. Just over 10,600 British and Polish airborne soldiers landed north of the Rhine at Arnhem. 9 days later, roughly 2,100 came back across the river. This video is built from both sides of that river, from the British memoirs, and from the interviews the writer Cornelius Ryan recorded in the 1960s with the SS soldiers who fought there. Ordinary men, not generals, whose accounts have sat in the archives for decades and are almost never used. You're going to hear the battle from the men of both sides who were inside it. By September 1944, the best of the German army had been dead for 2 years. The men who had smashed through France in 6 weeks in 1940, who had driven to the gates of Moscow and taken Sevastopol, who had been the most effective military force in Europe since Napoleon, had been ground into the soil of the Eastern Front at a rate that no replacement system could match. The Waffen-SS had bled most heavily of all. The Leibstandarte, Das Reich, Totenkopf, the elite formations that had earned their reputations in Russia and North Africa, had been rebuilt again and again, their rosters filled with men who had not the experience or the instincts of the soldiers they were replacing. By the summer of 1944, after Kursk, after Bagration, after the collapse of Army Group Center, the Waffen-SS division that arrived at the front was numerically a division and qualitatively something considerably less. The knowledge was gone, the institutional memory of how to survive and how to kill, dying with the men who carried it. The 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen and the 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg, the two divisions that would fight the British at Arnhem, were in September 1944, in the process of being rebuilt after destruction in Normandy. They had been badly mauled at Falaise, had retreated across France with the rest of Army Group B, and had been sent to the Netherlands to refit. They were short of men, short of tanks, short of fuel, and short of almost everything that a panzer division was supposed to have. When the British paratroopers landed outside Arnhem on September 17th, the Germans who would have to fight them were a formation in name more than in reality. What they had was experienced officers in reasonable numbers, some artillery, some armoured vehicles, and a specifically SS quality of tactical aggression that did not diminish with the state of their equipment. The man who commanded both divisions, Lieutenant General Wilhelm Bittrich, had been fighting since Poland in 1939. He was 52 years old, a former Luftwaffe officer who had transferred to the Waffen-SS, one of the few senior commanders in the entire German army, who combined operational intelligence with the specific kind of moral flexibility that had allowed him to survive 5 years of the Eastern Front without being killed either by the enemy or by the system he served. When Field Marshal Walter Model, Army Group B commander, called him in the first hours after the Allied landings and asked what he was facing, Bittrich assessed the situation accurately within the hour. British paratroopers, he told Model. A large force, well equipped, objective probably the bridge at Arnhem. He had both divisions moving before the full intelligence picture was clear. The British paratroopers who had landed north and west of Arnhem were the 1st Airborne Division under Major General Roy Urquhart. They were among the best soldiers in the British Army, and they had a specific problem within hours of landing. The plan called for them to secure the bridge and hold it for 48 hours, while XXX Corps drove north along the road from the Belgian border to relieve them. The plan had a radio problem, a timing problem, and a distance problem, all of which became apparent almost simultaneously on the afternoon of September 17th, and none of which the men who had been dropped into the fields west of Arnhem were in any position to fix. The radio problem was that the frequencies the British planned to use for communication did not work in the terrain around Arnhem. The tall trees and the specific geography between the landing zones and the bridge absorbed the signal. Companies that should have been in contact with brigade could not raise them. Battalions that should have been coordinating with division headquarters were operating independently. The command structure that made a paratroop division a coherent fighting force rather than a collection of isolated units was not functioning within hours of the landing. The timing problem was that the 3 battalions intended to race for the bridge immediately on landing were slowed by the discovery that the roads into Arnhem were blocked by something the intelligence assessment had not adequately addressed. The intelligence had noted that there were German forces in the area but had assessed them as low quality, training formations, logistics units, the kind of second-line troops that a veteran airborne division could brush aside in an hour. The intelligence was wrong. The forces on the roads between the landing zones and the bridge were the 16th SS Panzer Grenadier Training and Reserve Battalion under SS Major Sepp Kraft, a formation of young soldiers and cadre instructors that should by any normal military calculation have had no business holding up a British airborne battalion for 10 minutes. Sepp Kraft was 33 years old and had been fighting since Poland. He had served on the Eastern Front, had seen the kind of punishment that SS formations took and the kind of punishment they gave, and when the British paratroopers landed in the fields around his training area on the afternoon of September 17th, he made a decision that was not in any operational plan, because no plan had anticipated his existence. He moved his battalion to the most obvious route between the landing zones and Arnhem, and he held it. His men, many of them barely 18 years old, many of them there to receive instruction rather than to give combat, dug in and fought a holding action that bought time the German command needed desperately, and that no one above Kraft had ordered. The battalion that got through was the 2nd Battalion of the 1st Parachute Brigade, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel John Frost. Frost had been fighting with the Parachute Regiment since the first British airborne operation had dropped in North Africa and Sicily, and had developed over 3 years a specific tactical instinct for the kind of fighting that paratroopers do. He took the southernmost route into Arnhem, the one that Kraft's men had not covered completely, moved his battalion at a pace that the other columns stuck behind Kraft's blocking positions could not match, and reached the northern ramp of the Arnhem Bridge at approximately 10 o'clock on the night of September 17th. He blew a hunting horn. It was a habit he had, using a hunting horn to call his companies into assembly when the normal signals methods had failed, and it suited the specific strangeness of what he had done. He had 800 men. He had reached the objective. He was approximately 60 miles inside German-held territory. He had no contact with division. He had no reliable information about when or whether the other battalions would reach him, and he was about to hold the most important bridge in the Allied strategic plan against whatever the German command could bring to retake it. Frost established his headquarters in a house on the eastern side of the ramp, placed his companies in the buildings around the northern approaches, and waited to see what the night would bring. What the night brought was the 9th SS Panzer Division's armoured cars trying to rush the bridge from the south at 1 o'clock in the morning. The cars came onto the bridge at speed and were met by concentrated fire from the paratroopers in the houses on both sides of the ramp. Some burned on the bridge, some made it through, some turned back. The German garrison, on the southern side of the bridge, a small detachment that had been holding the structure before the British arrived, was overwhelmed and killed or captured. Frost's men controlled the northern approaches, neither side controlled the bridge deck itself, which meant that for the next 4 days, nobody could cross it in either direction without dying. Alfred Ringsdorf was 21 years old in September 1944, a private first class in the 1st Company of the 21st SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment, Frundsberg. He had fought in Russia and had the specific quality that the Eastern Front produced in the survivors, an ability to process extraordinary violence at close quarters and continue functioning. On the morning of September 18th, he was on a freight train near Arnhem en route to an outfitting depot when the train stopped and officers came down the line telling the soldiers to get off. He was given 3 magazines of ammunition. He was assigned to the bridge fighting. He had not been briefed, had not slept in a bed, had not eaten a proper meal, and was being committed to the most intense urban combat of the entire Arnhem battle with 3 magazines, and the knowledge that something British was holding a bridge somewhere ahead of him. He described what he found in an interview with Cornelius Ryan, the historian who wrote A Bridge Too Far, given 23 years after the battle. "It was the hardest battle I ever took part in," Ringsdorf said, and he had fought at Kursk, always close-range fighting with no definite demarcation lines. The English were everywhere and often a bare 5 meters away. We had to fight every inch of the way to the end of the bridge. We had to clean out one corner after another. The houses were burning in our sector, and it was terribly hot. The fight around the bridge ramp was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was an accumulation of specific violence in specific buildings across specific streets, each engagement isolated from the others by the terrain, each involving men who could not see the larger picture, and were fighting entirely on what they encountered in the next doorway and the next window. Ringsdorf moved through rubble, through burning buildings, through rooms where the walls had been blown away by the previous hour's fighting. He volunteered to carry a demolition charge across an open square to a British machine gun position in a cellar. While he ran, the tall house behind him collapsed, burying a Wehrmacht engineer platoon that had been standing in the position his squad had occupied 10 minutes earlier. The charge he carried never detonated. He was alive because of the specific timing of his movement across one square in one street of one city. On the British side, in the houses around the northern ramp, the men of the 2nd Battalion were experiencing the same fight from the same distance in a different direction. Private James Sims, a mortar platoon soldier who wrote about the siege afterward, described the specific quality of what close-quarters urban combat does to men who have been in it for hours. The noise never stopped. The smell of burning, of cordite, of things that should not be burning. Men you had been talking to at breakfast no longer existed in any identifiable form. The specific horror of Arnhem for the British defenders was not the intensity of the fighting, which they had trained for and which they could manage, but the silence from the radio, the absence of any information about what was happening to the division that was supposed to be coming through the city to reach them. Urquhart was not coming. The divisional commander had moved forward on the afternoon of September 17th to assess the situation personally and had been cut off from his headquarters by the German blocking positions. He spent the night of September 17th and most of September 18th in an attic in Arnhem, 2 Dutch civilians and 2 of his officers, listening to the fighting below him, unable to communicate with anyone in his division, while his 3 brigades fought independently and without coordination against the German forces that Bitterick was moving into position around them. The 1st Airborne Division was fighting leaderless at the moment it most needed direction. Victor Grabner brought his reconnaissance battalion onto the bridge on the morning of September 18th, without knowing with certainty that the British were there in strength. He may have believed, or decided to act as though he believed, that the force holding the ramp was small enough to be pushed through by speed and aggression. This was a characteristically SS calculation, the bet that what could not be known for certain could be forced by the willingness to move at a velocity that the defender could not absorb. Grabner had received his Knight's Cross the previous evening. He had done enough fighting to know that the bet sometimes worked. He pumped his fist, and the column accelerated. The column was destroyed on the bridge. The paratroopers in the houses on either side of the ramp had every approach route registered for their weapons. The half-tracks, open-topped, were death traps for the men inside them when the grenades came through the open tops. The armoured cars had guns that could not be elevated sufficiently to engage targets in the upper floors of the buildings flanking the ramp. Grabner was killed early in the action. His body was consumed in one of the fires the burning vehicles produced and was never recovered. Of the 22 vehicles he had led onto the bridge, most burned where they stopped. The column that had looked like a charge looked afterward like an accident, the random collection of destroyed hardware that accumulates in a place where violence has been total. Ringsdorf crossed that bridge after the battle ended. He described it in his account to Cornelius Ryan. We went over the bridge on which lay burnt-out vehicles. The drivers were still inside. They were burned and charred black. These were Grabner's men, the men of the reconnaissance battalion, still in the seats they had been sitting in, when the grenades came through the tops of their vehicles. Ringsdorf crossed over them to get to the south side of the bridge. That is what the battle at the northern ramp of Arnhem Bridge looked like from the feet of one of the men who fought it. The fighting on and around the ramp continued for 4 days. The German command was bringing every available unit to bear against Frost's position. The 9th SS was attacking from the north and west. The 10th SS was working to isolate the bridge position completely, while simultaneously stopping the 3 British battalions that were still trying to fight through the city to reach it. Kraft's blocking positions were holding the road into Arnhem. The second lift, bringing the rest of the 1st Airborne's fighting strength, had been delayed by weather, and had landed into a situation that had already deteriorated beyond what the original plan could address. The German command at the level above Bitterick was model, and Bitterick's superior was a man named Kurt Student, the general who had invented airborne operations for Germany, and who understood what he was looking at when the British parachutes appeared over Arnhem. He was 64 years old and had been running airborne forces since the Netherlands in 1940 and Crete in 1941. When the intelligence came in about what the Allies were doing, Student understood the operational logic immediately. They were trying to bounce a series of bridges in a single operation, land enough men behind the German lines to hold crossings that ground forces could then use to outflank the entire German defence of the Rhine. It was ambitious to the point of recklessness. Student had done the same thing himself on a smaller scale in 1940. He knew what it meant when the intelligence did not all arrive on time and the timing began to slip. The 3 battalions fighting through Arnhem to reach Frost did not break through. They could not break through. The SS formations holding the roads into the city centre were too strong in the specific terrain of Arnhem streets and buildings, and the British battalions attacking them were losing cohesion under the sustained pressure of fighting that produced casualties at a rate the available strength could not absorb indefinitely. By September 19th, the attempt to reinforce Frost had effectively failed. The 4th Parachute Brigade, landed in the second lift, was fighting a separate battle on the north side of Arnhem, trying to reach a position it could not reach. The 1st Airborne Division was contracting toward the village of Oosterbeek, approximately 3 kilometres west of Arnhem, where the terrain and the buildings gave the remaining paratroopers the best available defensive ground. Frost's men at the bridge knew none of this. They knew their radios were not working. They knew the other battalions had not reached them. They knew the Germans were bringing more and heavier weapons to bear against their positions. What they did not know, and what would not be fully clear to them until the morning of September 20th, was that they were alone. Major John Greyburn was commanding a platoon at the bridge in the first hours when the German column came onto the ramp and was destroyed. He placed his men in the houses closest to the German advance and fought with the specific recklessness of a man who had identified which way the situation was going and decided that what he could do was make it as expensive as possible for the other side. He was wounded on the first night and continued to fight. He was wounded again and continued. He organised defensive positions, led counterattacks against German sections that had penetrated into the houses the British held, maintained a presence in the forward positions that kept his men functional when the rational calculation would have been to pull back. He was killed on the night of September 20th, still at the bridge, still fighting. He was awarded the Victoria Cross. The citation describes specifically what he did and how long he did it and what it cost him. In the houses around the bridge, the wounded accumulated. The cellars became hospitals without the equipment to be hospitals, men lying on stone floors with whatever the medical orderlies had been able to carry, and whatever additional medical supplies could be taken from the dead. Private Sims wrote about the thirst specifically, the absence of water in a battle that had burned through the supply the men had carried with them in 48 hours. The wounded men asked for water. There was no water to give them. The fires in the upper floors of the building sent heat down through the structures that made the lower floors where the wounded lay into something approaching an oven. The men who could still fight moved between the fires and the cellars, up to the positions when called, down when the position could be held without them, past the wounded who were no longer moving in the direction they needed to go. Ringsdorf, fighting in the same streets from the other side, described what his experience of the battle produced in him. No one who has lived through such a terrible experience, whose life had hung by a thread, can tell me that he was not afraid, he said. I don't care if he has the Knight's Cross with diamonds. I'm not really a religious man, but I prayed during this battle. He described the specific incident with the grenade. He was moving through rubble toward a building that the British were defending when he saw a helmeted head duck into a cellar entrance. He pulled the pin on a grenade. He heard from inside the cellar the sound of someone shouting, "No, no," and then moaning. He did not throw the grenade into the cellar. He went down and found a cellar full of wounded British soldiers. I was very glad that I had not thrown that grenade in there, he said. He took them prisoner and had them carried to treatment. This is what the battle at the level of the individual soldier looked like from both sides. Men killing each other at 5 meters. Men choosing not to kill each other in the specific circumstances where the choice was possible. The same man in the same battle, doing both within the space of hours. There is no clean way to tell this story, because there was no clean way to fight it. Lieutenant Commander Vogel was the company commander of Ringsdorf's unit, a man who had served with his men long enough to know them individually. He ended every meeting with the specific phrase, "I'd like to see you again alive," which, after enough repetitions, became a specific expression of care in a situation where care was the only thing he had to offer. He was killed at the gate of a garage on the main square, ripped open from top to bottom by machine gun fire 20 meters in front of Ringsdorf. Ringsdorf was a private first class. He took command of the company. This is also what the battle at the level of the individual soldier looked like, the replacement of professional leadership with the improvised authority of whoever was still standing. Horst Weber was 18 years old, a Panzer Obergrenadier in the 10th SS Frundsberg, garrisoned in a house on the western edge of the fighting that the British called the Devil's House. Wounded British soldiers approached the house asking for shelter. The Germans took them in. Weber described what followed. Finally, there were heavily wounded British soldiers lying everywhere on the cold stone floor. We gave our 2 first aid kits to this British doctor, who cared for his men unceasingly for 2 days and nights without sleep. His human warmth and presence moved us. We helped him where we could. When the battle in that sector ended, and the British surrendered their position, Weber said we shook hands and wished each other the best. What Bittrick's forces could not prevent at the bridge they were ensuring at the level of the whole battle. The British perimeter at Oosterbeek was contracting under constant pressure. The German forces surrounding it were growing as reinforcements arrived, and the question became not whether it would fall, but when and at what cost. The conditions inside the perimeter were deteriorating in the specific way that siege conditions deteriorate, each day producing fewer men capable of fighting and less ammunition for those men to fight with. Kate Terhorst was a Dutch woman living in Oosterbeek in a large house that the British medical services took over as a dressing station during the battle. She stayed. She moved through the rooms where the wounded were lying and read aloud to them from the 91st Psalm. He that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. The house took in wounded from the fighting around it for the duration of the battle. The grounds of the house became a cemetery for the men who died there. When it was over and the British counted the graves, there were 57 of them in Kate ter Horst's garden. The battle inside the Oosterbeek perimeter produced 2 Victoria Crosses awarded for actions on the same day, September 20th. Major Robert Kane was commanding a company that was repeatedly attacked by German armour and infantry. He went out with a Piat anti-tank launcher, a weapon that required the operator to be within 30 metres of a tank to have any reliable chance of stopping it, and engaged German armour through multiple attacks across multiple hours. He was wounded in the face by grenade fragments at one point, treated, and went back out. He was temporarily blinded by the blast of his own PIAT at another point, and when his sight partially returned, he continued firing. He destroyed or disabled a significant number of German armoured vehicles across the duration of the battle around his position. Lance Sergeant John Baskyfield, in the same perimeter on the same day, operated a 6-pounder anti-tank gun with depleted crew until the gun was put out of action and he was wounded, then crawled to another abandoned gun and continued firing alone until he was killed. Both men received the Victoria Cross. The actions described in the citations are the kinds of things that happen in a battle that has been going on long enough that the only choices left are the ones that end in a Victoria Cross or a grave, and sometimes both. On September 21st, 7 days into the fighting at Arnhem, something happened that has no parallel in the battle histories of the Second World War. Lieutenant Colonel Graham Warwick was the senior British medical officer in the Oosterbeek perimeter. He went to the German lines under a white flag to request a ceasefire to evacuate the wounded. He was taken to Bitterick. Bitterick agreed without extended discussion. He provided German transport, German medical personnel and an escort, and he told Warwick to take whatever time was needed. SS Captain Egon Skalka, the senior German medical officer, drove Warwick back through the battle in a captured Allied jeep with a British prisoner of war holding a Red Cross flag on the bonnet, while fighting continued on both sides of their route. More than 1,200 wounded British soldiers were evacuated from the perimeter in German vehicles in the course of the ceasefire. Bitterick sent brandy to Urquhart with the message, "For your general." Field Marshal Model, Bitterick's superior, exploded when he found out. "What the hell were you thinking?" he demanded. Bitterick had allowed enemy soldiers to be evacuated under a ceasefire agreement he had made unilaterally, without authorization, in the middle of a battle that was still ongoing. Model ordered the practice stopped. Bitterick had done it anyway, and it was done. This is also the Battle of Arnhem, not the part that the film shows, not the part that fits cleanly into a narrative of good versus evil, but the part that the men who were there recorded, and that the accounts preserve. A German SS general arranging the evacuation of British wounded in German transport during a battle he was winning. A German private choosing not to throw a grenade into a cellar full of wounded British soldiers and then carrying them to treatment. An 18-year-old SS Panzer Grenadier sheltering wounded enemy soldiers and giving them his unit's medical supplies and shaking their hands when they surrendered. None of this erases what the Waffen-SS was or what it had done on the Eastern Front and elsewhere. It exists alongside those things, in the same men, in the same war, in the same 9 days. The Oosterbeek perimeter held until the night of September 25th, when the British command authorised the evacuation of the surviving men across the Rhine, under the name Operation Berlin. The evacuation moved under darkness, men making their way in small groups to the riverbank, crossing in whatever boats were available under German artillery fire that lit up the water intermittently throughout the night. The Poles, who had been landed on the south bank of the Rhine during the battle and who had been unable to cross in sufficient strength to affect the outcome, were among those providing covering fire from the south. They had watched the battle from across the water for days, separated from the men they had been sent to assist by a few hundred metres of river, and the specific impossibility of crossing it under German fire in sufficient numbers. The crossing at night succeeded partially. Of the approximately 10,000 men of the 1st Airborne Division who had landed in and around Arnhem 9 days earlier, approximately 2,400 made it back across the Rhine. The rest were dead, wounded, or prisoner. The Germans took approximately 6,000 prisoners from the Arnhem fighting, among them Frost, who was wounded in the fighting at the bridge and captured on the morning of September 21st after 4 days of holding a position he had been told would be held for 48 hours. He was in a German hospital when the rest of the division crossed the river on the night of September 25th. Ringsdorf crossed the Arnhem Bridge on foot after the battle ended and walked over the wreckage of Grebner's column. He was sent to Elst, south of Arnhem, where Frundsberg units were fighting to hold back the British 30 Corps ground advance that had come too late and too slow to save the Arnhem operation. He described arriving at the house his unit was holding, the one-legged Major Knaust in a smoky room. "Where do you come from, son?" Knaust said. "Here, have a drink." Between engagements, sitting at a piano in the house, Ringsdorf played a German military song, "Ich bin dein Kamerad," I am your comrade. A Sherman shell came through the wall mid-song. He was hit in the arm. His trousers were shot open between the legs. He ran. The Tigers that came up the road shortly afterward destroyed the Shermans. He described what he heard. When the fighting in his sector finally stopped. "I did not even hear a bird sing until after it was all over," he said. "It was when we were gathered all together that I consciously heard a bird singing. It was like coming back to life." He was asked about the British soldiers he had fought against across those 9 days. "What most impressed me was the fairness of the English soldier," he said. "He fought hard and well. We laughed and said, 'Prima, Tommies, prima gekämpft. Great Tommies, great fighting.' After all, we were all soldiers and had no reason to be unfriendly." He was asked about Frost specifically, the man who had held the bridge from the inside while the German forces tried for 4 days to take it back. "Frost did not surrender," Ringsdorf said. "He stayed to the very last. This in itself alone commands respect." Frost was repatriated after the war ended. He lived until 1993. He wrote a memoir called A Drop Too Many. The bridge at Arnhem was renamed after him. It is called the John Frost Bridge. When British veterans visit it, they say they can still hear the hunting horn. Victor Grebner lies under a cross that gives no name. The men who were with him on the bridge that morning, who burned in their vehicles while the British paratroopers in the upper floors of the houses fired down at them, are in cemeteries in the Netherlands in graves that name them specifically, and specifically do not name what they were, what they had done before that morning, or what they would have done if they had lived. They are names and dates and the shape of a cross. The bridge they tried to take is named for the man who stopped them. Operation Market Garden, the Allied operation of which Arnhem was the final bridge, failed. The Rhine was not crossed in September 1944. The war continued through another winter in conditions that neither the planners of Market Garden nor its participants had intended to still be fighting through. Whether a successful operation at Arnhem would have shortened the war materially is a question that historians have been arguing since 1944 and have not resolved. What is certain is that the men who fought there, on both sides, fought with a specific intensity that the accounts preserve and that the distance of 80 years has not diminished. The bird was singing and it was like coming back to life. The drivers were still inside and they were burned and charred black. These two sentences from the same man, about the same 9 days, are Arnhem. The Germans who came to Arnhem in September 1944 were not who they had been 3 years earlier, and this matters for understanding why the battle went the way it did. The 9th SS Hohenstaufen and the 10th SS Frundsberg had both been formed in 1943 from volunteers, conscripts and transfers, had received training that was compressed relative to the pre-war SS standard because the army needed divisions faster than the training cycle could produce them properly, and had gone to the Eastern Front and then to Normandy carrying the SS insignia and the SS tactical doctrine into situations that consumed their personnel at rates that made the pre-war SS concept of a trained elite formation increasingly nominal. The men who fought at Arnhem were the survivors of that process and the replacements for those who had not survived it. Some of them were exceptional soldiers by any standard, some were teenagers in their first serious engagement, most were somewhere between these poles. What they shared, and what the British accounts consistently note with something between respect and frustration, was a capacity to attack into uncertainty that did not diminish with the state of their equipment or the clarity of their information. Bitterick had 2 partially equipped, partially trained divisions, and he used them to contain an entire Allied airborne division within the first 24 hours of the battle. Kraft had a training battalion, and he used it to block the roads into Arnhem long enough for Bitterick's main forces to establish their positions. The quality that the Waffen-SS had built into its formations through years of institutional culture, the willingness to attack when the situation was ambiguous and the calculation was not clearly favourable, was still there in September 1944, even when most of the men who had originally possessed it were dead. Field Marshal Walter Model was at his headquarters in the Tafelberg Hotel in Oosterbeek, approximately 3 kilometers west of the Arnhem Bridge, when the British paratroopers landed on the afternoon of September 17th. His staff had just served lunch. The hotel, which sat in landscaped grounds on the edge of the village, had been commandeered for Army Group B headquarters 2 weeks earlier, and Model had been using it as a working and living space in the way that senior German commanders had used requisitioned civilian properties throughout the war. When the reports came in about the landings, his initial instinct was that this was a specific assassination attempt against him personally, that the British had determined his location and were landing troops specifically to capture or kill the Army Group commander. He was wrong, but the assessment was not unreasonable given the intelligence available in the first minutes. He evacuated the hotel, moving his headquarters to Doetinchem to the east, and left the British paratroopers to land around a building that would subsequently become one of the main dressing stations for British wounded. The failure of XXX Corps to drive the road from the Belgian border to Arnhem in the 48 hours the plan allocated is the part of the battle that the British accounts return to most consistently. The grinding frustration of men who could hear the battle happening ahead of them and could not reach it. The road from Eindhoven through Nijmegen to Arnhem was elevated above the surrounding polders in the Dutch countryside, a raised single-lane highway with no alternative routes for vehicles as heavy as tanks. If the road was blocked at any point, the column stopped. The German forces defending against XXX Corps understood this perfectly and exploited it with the specific intelligence of men who had been fighting the British Army for 4 years and knew its procedures. Anti-tank guns placed in the fields to the sides of the elevated road could fire at the British tanks at angles that the tank guns could not easily return. Knocked-out vehicles on the road surface stopped the column behind them. The schedule that Arnhem depended on was not a schedule that the terrain would permit. At Nijmegen, where the Americans of the 82nd Airborne had landed alongside the British operation, there was a second bridge that needed to be taken before XXX Corps could drive the final 20 kilometers to Arnhem. The Germans held the south end of the bridge and the situation was stalemated until an American battalion commander proposed something that the airborne officers who heard it initially believed was a death sentence rather than a plan. Major Julian Cook of the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment would take his battalion across the River Waal in canvas boats in daylight against the German positions on the north bank to take the northern end of the bridge while British tanks and infantry attacked the south end simultaneously. The boats were inadequate, the river was wide and fast-flowing, and the German positions on the north bank were prepared and manned. Cook agreed to do it. He did it. Of the 260 men who made the crossing, approximately 200 survived to reach the north bank and fight their way to the bridge. British tankers who watched the crossing from the south bank described it as the most extraordinary thing they had seen in the war. The Nijmegen Bridge was taken on the evening of September 20th. By that point, the fighting at Arnhem Bridge had been going on for 3 full days, and Frost's men were nearing the end of what they could hold. The 20 kilometers between Nijmegen and Arnhem should, in theory, have taken the British armoured column approximately an hour to drive. The road between the two cities ran through Elst, where Ringsdorf and the Frundsberg forces were now positioned specifically to prevent exactly this movement. XXX Corps halted for the night and resumed in the morning. The morning of September 21st was 4 hours too late. Frost's position at the bridge was overrun in the early hours of that morning. The men who could still walk surrendered. The men who could not walk were taken to treatment. The 3 British battalions that had been fighting through the streets of Arnhem to reach Frost and had not reached him, the 1st, 3rd and 11th Parachute Battalions, had been reduced by 4 days of continuous fighting to fragments of their original strength. The 1st Battalion, which had gone into Arnhem on the evening of September 17th, with approximately 600 men, mustered fewer than 40 soldiers when it was incorporated into the Oosterbeek perimeter on September 19th. The 3rd Battalion had similar losses. The 11th, attempting to break through from a different angle, had been stopped and broken in fighting that lasted most of September 18th. The survivors of all 3 battalions were absorbed into the defensive perimeter around Oosterbeek and became part of the force that held that perimeter until the night of September 25th. The Polish Parachute Brigade under General Stanislaw Sosabowski arrived late, having been delayed by the same weather that had delayed the British second lift, and landed on the south side of the Rhine, opposite Dryle on September 21st, the day Frost's position fell. They were too few and too late to affect the outcome at the bridge. For 3 days, They watched the battle from across the water, within sight and sound of the perimeter that was fighting to survive on the north bank, separated from it by the Rhine, and by the German positions that controlled the crossing points. Sosabowski made multiple requests for boats to be brought forward, so his men could cross and reinforce the perimeter. The requests were fulfilled slowly, inadequately, and too late for the few men who did cross to make a material difference. The Poles watched the operation they had been sent to support collapse from 300 meters away. The specific frustration of being that close and unable to reach the men on the other side is recorded in the Polish accounts with a bluntness that the more diplomatically filtered British official histories do not match. Sosabowski had argued against the plan before it was executed, had told the British planners that the schedule was too tight and the margins too thin, and had been overruled by men who believed that the German army in the west was broken enough to make the risks acceptable. His assessment had been correct. His men watched the evidence of its correctness burning on the north bank of the Rhine for 4 days. The SS Panzer Grenadiers in the Oosterbeek perimeter were fighting men who had been awake for days, who were low on ammunition, who were eating what they could find in the houses where they took shelter during the brief pauses in the fighting, and who were doing this with the specific competence of professional soldiers who had been trained to keep fighting when the circumstances provided no rational basis for optimism. The German accounts of the Oosterbeek fighting describe opponents who showed no sign of breaking despite the weight of German pressure being applied to the perimeter. They kept fighting. The German after-action reports noted beyond what could be expected of men in their situation. Bittrich, years after the war, was asked what he made of the British soldiers he had fought at Arnhem. He said that he had the greatest respect for the men who had held the bridge and the perimeter. He said specifically that the British airborne soldier was among the best infantry soldiers he had ever encountered. He said this without qualification, and it was not a statement he needed to make. He was an SS general, talking to researchers after a war his side had lost. The statement does not rehabilitate the SS or diminish what the Waffen-SS had done and been. It records what one specific professional soldier, having fought a specific battle against a specific opponent, concluded about that opponent. The escape across the Rhine on the night of September 25th was not a clean evacuation. Men moved through German-held ground in darkness and silence, with the specific instruction to avoid making any sound that would bring fire down on the column. Some were captured before reaching the river, some were wounded crossing the open ground between the perimeter and the bank. The river itself in the darkness was crossed in whatever boats the Royal Engineers had been able to bring forward, and the crossing was under intermittent German artillery and mortar fire throughout the night. The men who made it to the south bank were taken back to the British lines, fed, given dry clothing and told to sleep. Of the roughly 10,000 men who had gone in, 2,400 came out. The graves that remained in the Netherlands after the battle were gathered and consolidated in the years after the war into the Arnhem Oosterbeek War Cemetery at Oosterbeek, which contains 1,760 graves from the battle. Most of the men buried there are British, most were killed between September 17th and September 26th, 1944, and most are identified. The German dead from the same battle are in the military cemetery at Ijsselstein in North Brabant, which contains almost 9,000 graves from the wider Netherlands fighting, including those from Arnhem. The German graves at Ijsselstein are marked differently from the British and Commonwealth graves, two names often sharing a single flat stone, in the style that the German War Graves Commission uses for its cemeteries. The names are there, the units are not. The bridge was renamed for Frost, the hotel where Model had his headquarters, from which he evacuated when the paratroopers landed, is now a hotel again, the Hartenstein, and it contains the Airborne Museum, Hartenstein, which tells the battle from the British and Allied perspective, with the specific emphasis that a memorial museum maintained by the nation that lost the battle gives to the subject. The Dutch remember the battle with a specific gravity that the participating nations do not quite match, because the battle happened to them as much as to the soldiers in their streets and their houses, with their civilians in the buildings that became dressing stations and command posts and defensive positions for 10 days of fighting. They had no way of preventing or influencing. Kate de Horst's house still stands in Oosterbeek. The garden, where the 57 graves were dug, is maintained. The graves themselves were moved to the Arnhem Oosterbeek War Cemetery after the war, identified and given a proper burial. The house is a private residence now, not open to the public. The garden is there. Victor Grabner is buried in a German military cemetery in the Netherlands under a cross bearing no name. The bridge he died trying to take is called the John Frost Bridge.